Hey guys, today I'm sharing the good, bad, and ugly of this TV stand makeover, using a newish to me paint to completely change the look of it. This dark rustic beast is what we started with. My sister actually gave it to me to make over, and I'm really curious to see what they think of it now. The biggest thing that I wanted to change, other than the paint job or the finish, was these little doodads that rotate to keep the doors closed. I don't know about you, but I think they are just so annoying when you have only one hand to open or close the door and it keeps falling down, and so you can't open or close the door correctly. And then to add a little challenge, I wanted to give it a complete 180 makeover. So instead of being a dark rustic piece, I wanted to make it look clean and modern and maybe add some cane to it. So let's dive in. First things first, I cleaned it all off with some Crud Cutter cleaner and degreaser and an old wet rag. Even though my sister took good care of it, it sat out in my garage for a few months, and well, honestly, every piece needs a good cleaning just to make sure that all of the gunk, dirt, and grime is off of it. Because when it comes down to it, paint doesn't like sticking to dirt and grime. And cleaning the furniture off with a degreasing cleaner is the easiest thing that you can do to make the paint stick better. Then I removed the glass from the middle door by removing the screws that held on these pieces of wood. Once the screws were out, the wood pieces easily came off, making it super easy for the glass to come out. Man, I love when things are easy. Then I got down to business and removed all of the hinges in the doors. I used an electric screwdriver to speed up the process without using my bulky drill. This is where the nightmare started. If you've ever painted a piece with doors and hinges, there's a pretty good chance you know what a pain it can be to put these doors back on after you've painted. So I wrestled around with what to do a little bit before I started taking off the hinges, and ultimately I just decided to take off the hinges and label everything really well and hope for the best. The other option was to tape off the hinges so they wouldn't get paint on them, but honestly it just sounded like a task to tape them all off at that point. I've done it both ways in the past and it has always worked out either way. And I'm not gonna lie, some of these screws did not want to come out on the first try, so I had to change the bit size, and eventually they all came off just fine. As I removed the hinges, I used tape to mark the hinges with information on where they go, and I also labeled the screws and wrapped them up in tape. Then I removed the door stops, or whatever you want to call them. I used the metal scraper that was skinny enough to fit under them, and then I pried them off. Oh, those were fun to remove. Some came off super easily, and others just took a lot more elbow grease and wiggling to get them off. But eventually, they all came off. So I filled the holes in with my favorite damage repair product, Quickwood. I think that I have managed to use this stuff in almost all of my makeovers. The Quickwood dries in about an hour, so after a little bit of a lunch break, I was ready to sand the Quickwood down with 220 grit sandpaper and clean off the dust with tack cloth. And then it was time to try something new. I really didn't want to sand the entire piece more than I had to, so I decided it was time to try to skip the scuff sanding. You might remember a few months back that I tested different primers on laminate to see how well they stuck, and the bin shellac based primer, not the synthetic kind, but the real bin shellac, stuck really well without any sanding. I brushed a little bit of the bin shellac primer onto the TV stand to do a little bit of a scratch test to see if it would really stick to this piece without scuff sanding. About an hour after, I did a little scratch test with my fingernails to see if it would scratch off easily. And guess what? It stuck pretty darn well for only being on there for an hour. It scratched a little tiny bit, but honestly, to really test it, I should have let it dry for at least 24 hours. So I was really happy with how well it stuck for only an hour after painting it on. So I decided to move forward with not scuff sanding this piece and moving on to the primer instead. And then I got another grand idea to try another new thing. Why not try to put bin shellac primer in my paint sprayer and see how it sprays and cleans up? Yeah, why not? So I did some research to make sure I knew how to get it cleaned out of my sprayer without ruining my few $100 sprayer. I really did not want to ruin this paint sprayer. And then I poured the bin shellac into my sprayer. I didn't need to thin it because this stuff is so thin already, but I did pour it through a filter to make sure any dried paint or little specks of debris didn't get in the sprayer and clog it up. Then I laid some plastic and cardboard down in my spray booth and moved the TV stand into the spray booth. I put on my respirator to protect my lungs and I got to work spraying. It sprayed so good. It was easy, easy peasy. I started with the backs and bottoms of the doors and shelves and then sprayed the TV stand, and then by the time I was done with that, the doors and shelves were dry enough to flip over and spray the other side. Unfortunately, though, I went through almost a quart just for one coat on this big TV stand. But I was starting to think that I could get used to spraying this primer on with my paint sprayer instead of using the spray cans or rolling it on. I hate rolling it on because I hate the marks that the rollers leave, and this stuff is just so easy to overwork and create extra texture. I've always preferred to spray it with the spray cans, but right now the spray cans are so stinking hard to find, and on top of that, it would be so expensive because I would need so many spray cans on this piece. Anyways, that second that I got done spraying that one coat of primer, I cleaned out my paint sprayer. So I dumped out the bin that was left in the container, and then I poured a bunch of ammonia into the container and I shook it all around to try to clean up the shellac inside. The back of the can of the primer and my research told me to not let the shellac touch water or else I would have some problems on my hand. So I made sure no water touched it until the ammonia cleaned it off first. Then I hooked it up to my hose and sprayed the ammonia out into a 5-gallon bucket. I was still wearing my respirator, but man, I totally regretted my life decisions at this point. Ammonia smells so strong. Like, so strong. And of course, I wish that I had better ventilation, even though the window was open with the fans running. So if I were to do it ever again, I would definitely clean it outside. And I would only spray the ammonia for like 5 to 15 seconds, like not long at all. My eyes are watering right now just thinking about it. Anyway, after I sprayed the ammonia through the sprayer to clean out the inside of the sprayer, I poured the ammonia out and put some water in the container and sprayed the water through the sprayer. And then I ran upstairs, took my sprayer apart, and cleaned all the smaller pieces like the tip and the needle with a little bit more ammonia. And then I rinsed everything with water after the ammonia did its thing. Thankfully, it cleaned up really nicely. I just absolutely hated how strong the ammonia was. After all of that, I went back to check on how the primer looked, and guess what I found? I found some bleed through. This is the reason that I harp so much about priming before painting. These stains will not go away until they're blocked with a proper primer, and shellac-based primers are the best at blocking them. Not the synthetic kind of shellac, but the true shellac primers. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. After there was a coat of primer all over, I could see a bunch of places that needed some attention with wood filler and caulk. This piece was definitely made to look rustic, so there were details that needed filled in. And since this piece was so dark before, all of the seams where wood was joined together looked great before being painted. But once you get light paint on those areas, they stand out like a sore thumb. So I filled all the cracks, dings, and gaps with wood filler. And then I filled the seams in the doors and inside the cabinet with paintable caulking. I'm curious though, do I say caulking weird? Or do you say it how I say it? I'd love to know in the comments. Anyway, I squeezed the caulk into the seams and then used my finger to push it into the seam. And then I used a wet paper towel to wipe the excess away. This stuff is not easy to sand at all, so it's best to wipe away the excess instead of just trying to sand it down later. Man, caulking the seams makes such a big difference when you're painting a piece a light color. Can you see the difference? And the best part, after the caulk dries for only 20 to 30 minutes, it's ready to paint. When the wood filler was dry, I sanded it down flush to the wood with medium grit foam sandpaper and my Surf Prep sander. I also took this time to sand the entire surface of the TV stand and the doors and shelves. One of the worst parts about spraying this primer is that it feels super rough when it dries, so it has to be sanded down smooth or the paint isn't going to be smooth. I timed myself while I was sanding, and it took an hour and a half to sand this whole thing down. But it's a good thing that I did. The inside wood was never really finished. It was really rough to begin with, and since I didn't scuff sand before, this was my chance to get it all smoothed out. After everything was sanded, I vacuumed up the dust that was left behind and wiped away the leftover dust with a tack cloth. Have you ever heard of tack cloths? They are so stinking good at picking up dust and getting it off your furniture so you can get a dust-free, smooth finish. Then, since I didn't want to spray bin in my sprayer because I didn't want to clean it out again, and I really didn't want to sand it down either, I sprayed my absolute favorite primer. This stuff isn't really marketed as a primer, but this clear shellac is basically the product in the bin shellac primer that blocks bleed through and helps give it amazing adhering property. And I knew that I needed to give it more coats of shellac to block any bleed through that might want to show its face. This stuff also sprays on pretty smooth, and it doesn't leave a rough surface that has to be sanded down. So I sprayed everything with a clear coat of shellac, and then I let it dry for a few days before I got back to it. It's always best to at least let it dry overnight to let it block bleed through better. When I came back to it, I knew that I needed more primer on it, and at this point I just hoped that it was more just for the coverage so I didn't have to use so much expensive paint. There were just too many spots that were black, and if I wanted to go a lighter color, I would need a bunch of coats of paint still. So I dug into my paint stash and I found this can of Bin synthetic shellac primer. It's a water-based primer that somehow is supposed to be like shellac primer. It's just not as good for blocking bleed through, so I still had most of a can sitting on my shelf waiting for a time where I might use it. The time was now, I guess. So I loaded it up into my paint sprayer and didn't have to worry about cleaning it with ammonia since it's water-based. It's thicker than regular Bin though, so I had to thin it out with a little bit of water. And then I sprayed a coat all over that TV stand. It sprayed really good too, and it cleaned out of my paint sprayer super easy right after I sprayed it. The next day I sanded everything down again just to make it smooth, and it sanded really easy and into a powder just like regular Bin does. And then I cleaned up all of the dust again with the vacuum and the tack cloth. But did you notice while I was sanding that there were some black spots still? This wasn't because of good coverage necessarily. This was from the open wood grain. When you spray product, it just doesn't get pushed into the wood grain like it does when you brush or roll it on. So I sucked it up and rolled some regular Bin primer inside of the cabinets and on the bottom of the shelves where the wood grain was really, really bad. I also rolled the primer on the edges where I had sanded through the primer and back down to the wood. After that primer was dry, can you guess what I did? I sanded again. But this time I sanded by hand with 220 grit, so I hopefully wouldn't sand through the wood again, and so I could knock down some of the texture that was left by the roller. And then, you guessed it, I cleaned up the dust again. All of those coats of primer finally had created almost full coverage, and I finally made it to the part where I paint with real paint. I wanted to try a newish to me paint on this because it doesn't require a top coat. Like, honestly, you should not top coat this because the top coat could cause problems. It is completely durable without top coat. So the paint I tried is from Sherwin and it's called Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel, and I got the satin sheen. First things first, I mixed it up really, really good, and then I poured it into my paint filter and into the sprayer container. It's a pretty thick paint, so I wanted to thin it out a little bit for my paint sprayer. I asked a few other painters that I know have used this paint for some pointers, and so I went with thinning it with about 10 to 15% water. So for a quart of paint, I added about a quarter cup of water. And then I mixed the paint and water together really, really well before putting my paint sprayer together. And then I rolled the TV stand into the spray booth. Before I sprayed it on the TV stand, I sprayed it onto some cardboard to make sure I liked how the sprayer was spraying it. And then I sprayed the paint all over the TV stand and the backs and bottoms of the doors and shelves. It sprayed beautifully. I tried to spray it on a little bit thicker than I normally would spray chalk paint because this paint is a self-leveling paint. But for it to self-level, it needs to take a little bit longer to dry, and so it needs a little bit more than a super thin coat of paint. Obviously, I don't want it to be too thick though, because if I sprayed it on too thick, it will run and puddle. It sounds a little bit complicated, but it really wasn't that difficult to find the middle ground. So, why did I choose this paint? It's an alkyd paint and it's waterborne, meaning you can clean it up with water and soap. But when it's cured, it's like an oil-based paint, and it is super durable like an oil-based paint. I don't understand the exact science behind it, but I think it's pretty cool. The kicker is it's about $100 a gallon, but with a contractor account, it was around $60 for the gallon. When you break it down though, even without a contractor account, furniture paint per quart can be anywhere from $20 to $35, so it's not too bad, especially for a really big project. I love that it's self-leveling too. I actually tested it with a regular old zebra paintbrush and it dried without leaving brush marks. I've actually rolled it too when I was helping the same sister paint her bookshelves, and it rolled on beautifully too. But, you know me, I love to spray my paint. This paint has a 4-hour recoat time, but I honestly didn't mind it. Compared to chalk paint that you have to top coat with 3 coats of paint, spraying 2 coats of this with a 4-hour wait time in between coats was not bad at all. Here's what it looked like after I sprayed everything. After about 2 hours, when the paint was dry to the touch, I flipped over the doors and shelves and painted the other sides. And then I let that coat dry for 2 hours. And by that point, the first coat on the TV stand and the first sides of the doors and shelves was ready for a second coat. When the paint was dry, though, it felt kind of like chalk paint. Not as rough, but not super smooth either. It kind of felt like overspray was settled on it. Also, since it leveled so well, I could see spots where I had rolled on the primer, and I was not a fan of that texture. I loved the sheen though. It was somewhere between a matte and a satin sheen. So I sanded it down again really lightly and cleaned up the dust again. And then I sprayed another coat of paint. Once again, it went on so good. But when it was dry, it felt chalky again. And there were a couple of spots of bleed through that were coming through still. So I rolled on some more good old bin primer to block these stains. There were also some black spots that almost looked like fisheye spots, but I saw them after the first coat and another coat of paint didn't make them go away. They were black, which confused me because I've never seen black bleed through before. But after sanding and spraying another coat, they were still there. So I rolled some bin primer over those spots too. And then on the left side of this video, by that circle, you can see some dark streaks too. These must have been some sort of bleed through too, because they didn't go away until after I primed them again with some bin. So since that second coat of paint felt chalky too, I started to wonder if it was because of me spraying the paint on. So I brushed the paint on the doors with my high-end Stahlmeister, I never know how to say that brand, but their paintbrush, to see if it was because of my choice of application. It went on great with the brush, and here's what it looked like while it was drying. You could see some brush marks, but not as bad as other paint leaves them. Unfortunately, though, the chalky texture was still there with the brushed on paint. So, once again, I sanded everything smooth, including where I rolled on the primer. And then I vacuumed up the dust, used the tack cloth again, and then I did some more research. I ended up deciding to throw some more money down the drain and buy the semi-gloss sheen of this paint in hopes that it would be smoother to the touch. So I put the semi-gloss in my paint sprayer. You know the drill. I filtered it, thinned it 10 to 15% with water, mixed it up really good, and tested the spray before I sprayed the piece. It sprayed beautifully, just like the satin sheen had. And then, just like before, I waited 2 hours, then I sprayed the other side of the doors and shelves. When it was dry, I liked the way that it felt a lot better than the satin sheen did though. But before I sprayed what I hoped would be my last coat of paint, I rubbed a brown paper bag over everything. The brown paper bag kind of is like a really fine grit sandpaper. It doesn't leave many scratches in the paint, but it helps it feel really nice and smooth. Then I wiped everything down with a tack cloth to make sure I didn't have any dust down anything. And then I sprayed a second coat of the semi-gloss onto the TV stand and the bottom and backs of the shelves and doors. I actually switched it up a little bit on this coat since I planned on it being my last coat. My goal was to move pieces out of the spray booth as soon as I could after I sprayed them, so the overspray that gets in the air wouldn't be able to settle on the painted surface and make the surface feel a little bit rough. Even though I had a fan on trying to move the overspray in the air out of the room as well. So I started with just the bottoms of the shelves. Once those were sprayed, I moved them out of the paint booth. And then I grabbed the doors and sprayed the backs of the doors. And then I promptly moved them out of the spray booth as well. Then I sprayed the TV stand, and once it was sprayed, I moved it out of the spray booth as well. After 2 hours had passed, I flipped the doors and the shelves over, and I painted the other side just as I had this last time. And guess what? Everything looked so good! So I cleaned out my paint sprayer and hoped and prayed that this project would be over soon. But before it could be over, I had a few final details to finish up. The hinges were black, which wouldn't really be a problem. I like black hinges with white paint. But I planned on adding cane to this piece still, so I really wanted the hinges to be like a champagne color to match the new hardware and the cane as well. So I sanded the hinges with 150 grit sandpaper, being really careful to leave the tape on the hinges so I knew which hinge was which. The sanding basically just knocked down the rough texture that was on the hinges, because remember, this piece was really rustic. Then I cleaned off the sanding dust with a tack cloth, and then I took the hinges outside and sprayed them with some clear shellac. I was hoping that the shellac would act like a primer under the paint, just like the TV stand. Paint on hinges can wear off so easily and look bad really fast, so I didn't want them to easily get chipped. So we'll see how this works. I'm not quite sure yet. While the shellac dried for an hour, I came back in and put the cane up. So the plan was to add it to the middle door where the glass was, because that would be a pretty easy place to add it, and cane is super trendy right now, so why not? I just bought a roll of cane off the internet and then measured the opening in the door and marked the cane just a little bit bigger so I wouldn't accidentally cut it too small. Once it was cut to the size of the opening, I threw it in my cooler. Well, the cooler actually had some warm water in it. Apparently, you're supposed to soak cane for at least 30 minutes before working with it to make it more pliable and easier to work with. So, while the cane soaked, I went back outside and sprayed the hardware. I used this champagne color spray paint from Rust-Oleum. I wore gloves so I wouldn't get too much paint on my hand, and then I sprayed the underneath a little bit, and then I sprayed the top. And then I set them up so then the top and the bottom could at least dry at the same time. It actually worked pretty well. I let it dry for maybe 20 minutes, basically to the point it was only slightly tacky. With spray paint like this, you want to spray another coat within an hour, or the can says to spray after 48 hours. And I was not about to wait 48 hours. Then I sprayed another really light coat to get the spots I first missed on the first coat. I should have also sprayed the screws for the hinges, but I didn't want to get the screws mixed up, and so I'll show you what I did later to that. After I sprayed the hinges again, it had been 30 minutes since I had put the cane in the water. So I went and dried it off a little bit with the towel and got to work stapling it to the door. Soaking it in water definitely made it easier to work with. Holy cow. So to attach the cane to the door, I used my little air compressor and this cheap staple gun that uses basic T50 staples. You could use a handheld utility stapler too. They use the same staples. I started attaching it on one side in the middle, and then I held it tight and stapled the middle on the opposite side. And then I stapled the middle on the other two sides. Then I worked my way around trying to pull the cane tight as I stapled it all in place. And then I used a really dull utility knife to cut the excess cane off. It would have worked so much better if I actually had a sharp blade in my utility knife. But that was what I had. When I was done, the cane felt a little bit flimsy and not completely stretched out, and I was a little bit worried about it. But I put the glass back in place, and I screwed the wood pieces in place to hold the glass on, and then I let the cane dry overnight. I was super impressed though, because after the cane dried, it had shrunk a little bit and it was so nice and tight. I honestly love how easy it was to add this cane. The next day, I put the doors back on. I was so glad that I had labeled all of the hinges and the screws. But man, I was so nervous that the doors were going to go back on right. And I had good reason to be nervous. The doors went on great, but they weren't able to close all of the way because of all of the paint that I had painted on them. I should have sanded them down a little bit before painting them, but I didn't. Or I shouldn't have put so many coats of paint on them. But I did. So I tried closing the doors to see where they were getting stuck at, and I used my old orbital sander to sand the doors slowly until I could get the doors to close. And if you're wondering why I'm struggling with my orbital sander and a huge vacuum hose, I let my mom and sister borrow my surf prep sander and my vacuum hose for a project at my sister's house. Thankfully, I haven't really needed it, but this is the one time that I wished that I had it. When I finally got all of the doors to close and there was some space to put a few coats of paint back in those spots, I got the bin shellac primer back out and brushed 3 coats on, letting it dry between coats. I cleaned the paintbrush with ammonia between coats and waited until the next day to paint over the primer. The next day, are you counting how many days this took me? I painted 2 coats of semi-gloss emerald urethane paint. It really was so easy to touch these spots up, but I was so annoyed that I had to do it. While I was waiting for the touch-up paint to dry though, I sprayed some of the hinge paint into a foam bowl so I could brush a little bit of paint onto the screws. And yeah, the foam bowl wasn't so smart because the paint ate right through it. So, when I sprayed it again, I sprayed it on some cardboard and it was so much better. Then I brushed some paint onto the screws and the hinges, and I used some paint thinner to clean out the paintbrush. Then I let all of the paint dry until the next day. Then there was one final step. Remember how I took off those door stops? Well, I needed something to keep the doors closed. So I cut some scrap wood and painted it white. Then I screwed a magnetic strip to it, and then I nailed the wood block inside the cabinet and screwed the metal strip onto the door. These magnets will keep the doors closed, but make it easy to open them up as well. Alright, before I share what it looks like now, please take a second to hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps us out, so thank you so much. So, here is what it looked like before, and here is what it looks like now. No more dark and rustic here, it's bright, clean, and modern now, with a little bit of trendy mixed in. In the end, I honestly am really happy with the finish. It's brush-free, smooth, and I know it will be durable too. What do you think of it now?